So do leave Fada to falter over Fada Sean you. You're all very, very welcome to RC County this evening. I appreciate the absolute open, so we're going to keep the doors and the windows, every window in the place is open so far, so hopefully there's a wee bit of air circulating. Really appreciate this coming out tonight for what I'm sure is going to be a really interesting talk. This is a talk that we have kind of toyed with over the last few years with our programmes, and when we saw that this book had been published, the 32, the Anthology of Irish Working Class Writers, sure it hit the spot, it was just perfect, and we thought it was a great opportunity to have this discussion. So we're very grateful to Kate and to Mick for coming along, and of course for Siobhan, our chair, who we're always grateful for here in our Anthology. She's a great friend of the centre, so thank you to all of our panel tonight. On behalf of Paul, his apologies, he isn't well and so can't make it this evening, and I know he was raging, because he was looking forward to it, but yeah, really appreciate this all coming. A few quick housekeeping items for me, just check your phones are on silent, the usual, there's no fire drills planned, so if the fire alarm goes off, follow the signs, there's one at the back and just straight out the front down the stairs. In terms of us here at RSA Canada, for anyone that doesn't know me, by the way, I'm Kate and I'm the development officer here, and have the best job in the world, I will argue, and we're delighted. This is part of our summer programme, our Clara Theory. It was to Galore, Anthony Kate's quite on. There's loads of really interesting talks coming up, some of which have already happened, some of which are coming up over the summer, and we'd absolutely love to see some of you back here, or even if you are calling in, these are about the road for a wee cup of coffee or a cup of tea or have a wee drink during the exhibition. So look, that's all for me. Siobhan McKillen is going to be chairing this evening, so I'll hand over to her very capable hands. Thank you very much, Joanna.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm normally an observer in the audience, I'm never out of the place, and when I was asked to do this, I was just absolutely overjoyed. The book itself, I couldn't put down once I started to read it, and I suppose as somebody who is interested and trying to emerge as a writer, it was just fascinating to hear everything in the book and to read it. So the 32 is an anthology of working class voices and was inspired by common people. There is a serious amount of talent in the book, ranging from Robbie Doyle, Kevin Barry, Claire Allen, Rick O'Shea, Senator Lynn Ruan, and our panel here tonight, Kate Burns and Dr. Michael Pearce. Paul McVeigh, the editor, is from the Springfield Road, just a stone throw from here, and is the book's editor of the Irish Times, a remarkable journey and inspiration to all young, inspiring writers. McVeigh conceived the idea following the success of The Common People, an anthology of working class writers, edited by Kit DeWall. He managed to crowdfund to create an Irish version, and the 32 was born. The wealth of talent on display is insane, with award winners of Bailey's Women's Prize, Impact Award, Booker's Prize, 2 Sunday Times short story winners, newspaper editors, playwrights, poets, radio presenters, a senator, and the late Lara McKee. In his introduction, McVeigh explains the challenges facing working class writers and the financial struggles they face, quoting the late great James Baldwin. Anyone who has ever struggled with poverty knows how extremely expensive it is to be poor. Often people give up on their dreams in the arts due to the financial pressures and reality of needing stability. When I began to read the 32, so much of the content resonated with me. There are many themes, and the diversity of voices from all regions of this island make it all the more interesting. Not only does the book showcase the best Irish talent, it gives an authentic experience of working class lives, and as I said, I couldn't put it down. Tonight we're joined by Dr. Michael Pearce and Kate Burns, who I'm going to hand you over to very shortly. Kate Burns is Belfast born, from the west of the city like myself. She is a past pupil of St Genevieve's and St Dominic's, again like myself, and she is also a past student of St Mary's Teacher Training College like myself, so we've got so much in common. Following the death of her husband, she retired from teaching and returned to education, undertaking courses in creative writing through the Queen's University Open Learning Programme, and has completed a Master's in Creative Writing. The trellis brings us on a journey of nostalgia as she brings us through past and present memories while reacquainting herself with her aunt. Dr. Michael Pearce is a senior lecturer in Irish literature in Queen's University Belfast. His research mainly explores cultural production of Irish working class life. He is also an author of Writing Ireland's Working Class, Dublin After O'Casey, and editor of recent collections, A History of Irish Working Class Writing and Rethinking the Irish Diaspora After the Gathering, co-edited with Dr. Joanne Devlin. Michael gives a powerful assessment and overview of the challenges and barriers that working class writers face in his contribution. His scholarly interest stems from those writers who resonated with him personally, such as Brendan Behan, Robert Trellis and Sean Casey, outlining how each used their craft to highlight powerfully inequalities in the society around them. I'm going to hand you over to Michael first of all, and then Kate will follow on. Thank you.
Okay, to sit here?
Yeah, whatever.
So I was asked kind of this evening to do a talk generally on my own journey, I suppose, and then also do an excerpt from my own piece in the book. But it's quite, it's an effort at an academic piece which looks at class in terms of Ireland, class in terms of literature, writing, publishing, and the general, I suppose, environment in which working class people try to get into the arts and get involved in community arts and things like that. So it's not the most poignant, evocative piece that people have come here for on a midweek evening. So instead what I decided to do, and especially with Paul not being able to make it as editor, I said maybe I'd talk a little bit about issues I think are important in terms of working class writing, and then maybe some examples from the book that are illustrative in that regard. I suppose in terms of my own journey, I felt that I was just talking to Mick about this before, who's also a contributor to the book, before we were up here. I came from a working class background, and like Mick or like Scott and lots of people here, ending up in university, and you're between two worlds, and you've got a very strong sense of actually code switching and being a fish out of water, and maybe imposter syndrome as well, to add to that. As an old pal of mine used to say, I'm very well balanced and a chip on both shoulders. But it's true that there is kind of a sense that you do, when you enter something like the academy, move into a very different social climate. And it's not something that people with you in, let's say, university notice or know or are familiar with. But you're acutely aware of it, I think, as a working class person. And I went to Trinity, which was 17 minutes from my own door, but in inner city Dublin, but they were very different worlds. And certainly growing up in inner city Dublin, I had a very strong sense that you were, very strong sense that you were othered. And even in let's say, there was a demonisation of people there. There was a stigma, not quite the stigma that there was West Belfast, obviously, but there was a stigma of growing up in Sheriff or growing up in town and being from that area. And also I went to a secondary school which was an Irish language secondary school, which actually was great because you end up with a mixture of classes, not by design, but actually ended up with parents sending their kids there because they wanted them to learn Irish. So you had all sorts of classes, which was unusual. If I went to the local school, O'Connell's, everybody's dad was working class or unemployed like my own, when you went to that type of school. But the other side of that was that you actually often felt acutely ashamed of your class. And sometimes that was, big things, but sometimes it was small things like the microaggressions that some of the writers in this of everyday life that people talk about. I always remember the Tropera box every year. You get this box for charity, and the teachers would shake it to see how much money were in it, And your parents would have no money, but my mother was, acutely kind of aware of respectability and appearances, and she'd, from her paltry amount of money, put money into the box so that you'd be one of the mid-ranking kids and nobody had noticed that you were poor. I even remember simple things like, we lived in a house, this is coming into the 90s in Dublin, where, before the Celtic Tiger, poverty was pretty bad, and we had an outdoor toilet still and didn't have a bathroom or hot water or things like that. And I can remember you'd be doing your French Orwell's kind of, they'd always, there was always questions about how many rooms do you have in your house. You'd lie, you'd have about 4 rooms, and all this, you'd always have extra holidays and extra activities that you didn't have in your real life. But there was all these things you were acutely aware that the people around you in your class didn't have. And I suppose, in terms of actually academic work on this, there's been a lot of good recent work by people like Teresa Crew and by people like Fergal Finnegan down south, Barbara Merrill, others who've done a lot of work actually on how acutely alienating education is for working class people. And Kathleen Lynch, one of the sociologists that talks about this, actually says one of the most alienating aspects of it is that we don't have those conversations about class in schools. We don't talk about class in universities enough. We don't talk about it in schools, in secondary schools enough. Someone recently, a graduate student, was chatting to me about this, and she was saying that she can remember her home economics teacher talking about, they did a section on social welfare and talking about writing the margins of the book, social welfare makes people lazy, and her own parents being on social welfare, and this still goes on. So she's only like in her early 20s, this kind of stuff still goes on because class isn't discussed in an explicit way, and I think that's important. So I suppose I've been involved in a recent book by a woman called Iona Burnell, and she has a lot of people actually who entered the academy the book is about people who working class academics, people who come from working class backgrounds and moved into academia, and they do a thing in it called autoethnography, where basically they talk about their own experiences and then try to do it in a scholarly way, talk about what other people experience and what the general experience is. And I found it very hard to write about some of my own experiences, but I'd read the rest of the book. I had the benefit of reading the rest of what everyone else had written and felt a bit emboldened by it, and then said I would. But even as someone who's a scholar who writes about this, it was interesting as well to think that you still feel difficult writing about your own experiences of poverty, that you feel like you're almost self-indulging. And actually what I found from that book, and it's coming out later this year, is it's a really powerful thing actually to see people disclosing these things, talking about them, because so much around being working class is often about shame, or being told you should be ashamed, or hiding your poverty, hiding your experiences. And one of the things that helped me along this path to become an academic who works on working class writing was actually the fact that we did have a class in university on British working class fiction. And I found that reading people like Robert Tressel or George Gissing or Nell Dunn or Pat Barker, all these great writers of working class British life, is that so much of their experiences resonated with me. And I know that Martin Doyle in his piece in this book actually talks about that, how he talks about how his own experience of reading was emancipatory, and says, working class writers were part of the mix too. Christy Brown, Sheila Delaney, Alan Sillitoe, David Story, and my favourite, Keith Waterhouse, whose Billy Lara said, I turn over a new leaf every day but the blots show through. Books connected me to a more benign Britain than the benighted regimes that misruled the North, and of course Martin Doyle coming from here. I suppose for me then that led me on a path and a journey to thinking, well, what about Irish working class writers? At the time, it's around the 2000s, there was very little written about Irish working class writing, but there's been a lot more since. Teresa Crew, so what I said I'd talk about tonight maybe is just some of the reasons I think working class writing is important, and writing is important for working class people. Teresa Crew, who's a sociologist who works on this kind of stuff, says one of the great things about education and education gives for people who do come through the system is what she calls aspirational capital, and she sees what she says is it's really a fancy word for hope, and so much in working class writing actually I think gives people hope and gives communities hope, and I think that's a key part of actually the texts in this. There's so much hope in them. And I think art and being involved in art and the opportunity to write and the expressivity of that is actually really important as well in terms of giving people hope. And I thought I'd read a poem from Paul Meehan that I think really encapsulates this for me. And it's she talks about when she traces the exact moment she became a poet to something that happened when she was in class in the 1960s in Dublin. And the poem is entitled "The Exact Moment I Became a Poet." It was in 1963 when Miss Shannon, rapping the duster on the easel's peg, half obscured by a cloud of chalk, said, "Attend to your books, girls, or mark my words, you'll end up in the sewing factory." It wasn't just that some of the girls' mothers worked in the sewing factory, or even that my own aunt did, and many neighbours, but that those words "end up" robbed the labour of its dignity. Not that I knew it then, not in those words, labour or dignity. That's all back construction, making sense, allowing also the teacher was right, and no one knows it like myself. But I saw then mothers, aunts and neighbours trussed like chickens on a conveyor belt, getting sewn up the way my granny sewed the sage and onion stuffing in the boards. Words could pluck you, leave you naked, your lovely shiny feathers all gone. I just think it's such a powerful poem, and about that feeling of actually being demeaned by a teacher, which a lot of working class people maybe have experienced, and by a teacher who's actually well-meaning in that poem. You know, one of the things about that teacher is they're actually saying, you know, look, keep reading, you might, you know, get an opportunity to get a better type of work, but also it's that feeling that, you know, she's undermining the importance of the work that members of her family do, and that image of the cloud of chalk, that feeling of the sweaty palms and the, you know, the humiliation and the embarrassment in the classroom. But what's interesting, she said this is where she became a poet, that this was an opportunity. This set her on embarking on a career to becoming in 2013 the Ireland Professor of Poetry, and the highest accolade I suppose you could have in Ireland as a poet. Kevin Barry has a lovely piece in the book that resonates with this on page 34. He talks about how about a month before I set my leaving cert in 1987, one of our teachers came in one morning and gave us a talk about our destinies. We were the top stream class in the school, considered to be the smarter kids, the good workers, but still in all, he said, you're likely to end up in bum office jobs around the town. I remember the phrase exactly, bum office jobs. He spoke for quite some time and he painted a grim enough future. If we didn't watch ourselves, he said, we'd be working in dreary little insurance offices and we'd be answering to bosses who had gone to the Crescent Comp. They would be no smarter than us, he said, but they'd have gone directly to university while we'd have been doing bookkeeping courses in the tech. He explained that it was systemic. His message, quite passionately delivered, was that we should struggle with all of our resources not to be placed in the boxes that were waiting for us. There's a really powerful piece in this as well, that kind of I think speaks to some of that feeling by Roddy Doyle, where he talks about bumping into a bank manager. And Roddy Doyle's kind of like, you know, normally quite a placid kind of a person, and the bank manager jokingly describes how his father, you know, came in one day and he was all dressed up and he was, you know, I think, was it
a mortgage?
It was to finish his mortgage, and he came in all dressed up, you know, to finish his mortgage, and the bank manager was laughing at, you know, the idea of this working class man all dressed up in his smarts, you know.
I think he had a cane or something.
It's something like that, maybe overdoing it a bit. But Doyle describes thinking about it's the first time since he was a teenager where we talk about clocking someone, you know, and that anger and that rage of feeling demeaned and humiliated, but the importance of writing and expressing that. And I suppose then another thing which I think is really important in working class writing is that thing of pride beyond shame, and the role of disclosure in that, the role of expressivity in that. And we think about the forgetfulness of history in this regard. Often actually the role of fiction, of writing, of coming up with things, is actually filling in the gaps that history doesn't. Kevin C. Cairns, a great historian of the Dublin tenements, you know, asked the question, who was least likely to sit down and write than women in the tenements who had lots of kids, little leisure time, little space, and who is less likely also to be chronicled by historians as having anything important to contribute to history. When we see, for example, projects like Lay Up Your Ends, which is done by Sharrowbank, a big theatre project here, where in the 1980s, where they interviewed women who worked in the mills and put their stuff on stage. One of the women who's involved in that project, Brenda Winters, described one of the millies who was in the audience saying, grabbing her by the elbow and saying, "Sure, that's not theatre, love. Anyone would enjoy that, And the whole thing was this wasn't theatre for her. It was something different because they'd been interviewed and they'd been part of the process. And I think of Justice as well. Christine was involved in that. We're here tonight. Women coming together, creating theatre together, writing about their histories, their everyday experiences. Here in the Spring Hill, in the 1970s, people were writing small plays about, the experiences of dealing with social welfare officers, things like that. And at the same time, there were people in Dublin actually writing poetry and short stories about it, but they didn't know they were both doing it,
Yeah.
But the importance of that in terms of giving people the space to think and express themselves. That emphasis on not knowing your place. There's a wonderful piece by Teresa Ryder in this book that talks about her father's illiteracy, which I think is really beautiful, thinking about how many people, working class people, don't have access and haven't had access to writing because it's simply that they haven't been able to write, and the refusal to be silenced, which is really powerful. For example, in Rosalie McDonough's piece on being a traveller, and on being kind of talked about and talked over, I think is a really powerful piece in the book as well. And I know Jim McVeigh is involved here with the James Connolly Centre. There's a recent novel, Stolen Fate, about the Magdalen laundries. But again, another thing that, another part of our history which was deliberately actually obscured, deliberately pushed on the carpet, the role of fictionalising in that, in imagining what these people experienced, in restoring the record. I think a big part of working class writing, I suppose, as well, is challenging stereotypes. And there's a wonderful piece by Rick O'Shea, who's known as a radio DJ down south, really famously known, and working on that for years. But he talks about how he came from Drimna and Crumlin. But Crumlin Drimla was a different thing, that actually it was a code word for criminality in the newspapers. People will think about the bad days when West Belfast was a code word for certain things, as well as synonymous with certain things as well in the mainstream media. And he talks about how, well, Crumlin Drimna, that's a different sort of place. It's a journalistic hand grenade, shorthand for dealing, shooting, feuding, tit for tat. Headlines have long proclaimed gangland, a theme park nobody asked for, full attractions, no one rides, car chase roller coasters, target practice ranges, a ghost train where everybody shoots up in the dark. I've never been there. And kind of that sense, and I always remember the piece from the play that you did in Justice, Christine, Bin Lids, where there's a bit at the end where the women repeatedly hear newspaper reports about West Belfast, and there's a chorus where they say, "That's not us, that's not us, that's not us," and they just keep repeating that. And it's a similar sense of kind of being written about, and so the role of working class writing actually in writing back and giving people a voice, I think is powerful and really important, and of defamiliarising things, of kind of challenging the normal narrative of how people think of unsettling things, I think is really important as well. I think another part is inclusion, where there, which is important about working class writing, is inclusion where there is exclusion. Let's face it, most of the arts is actually, codified with ideas of elite arts, about high art, that art is intrinsically something that working class people don't do. And the role of the community arts in the last 30, 40 years in changing that has been profound, including things like Fela in this area. I can't think of a better example of a festival in a working class area. There's certainly nothing like it down south to the same level, where actual working class people are involved in creating content, and where they also, which is wonderful, we were talking about code switching earlier, how people code switch when they're in different environments, people change their accents when they go into universities and all that kind of thing, but they kind of do the opposite of that in a way. They double code, from the very start. Fela would have a Beckett play and a darts tournament next to each other in the brochure. You know, I think that's wonderful. You know, and it's still got that kind of wonderful thing where you know, they keep the prices reasonably cheap, but it's still got that wonderful thing where you have, you know, all sorts of art included with each other, that there's no sense of a barrier between the two, and that sort of crisscrossing and twisting of different environments, I think, is really important. We see it in the likes of Sean O'Casey, you know, who was brought up in a house with the Bible and Shakespeare, and styles himself as an intellectual, even though he's working as a labourer on the Great Northern Railway. Lots of working class writers like that, autodidacts, people who taught themselves, and have a certain, like Riley Johnson in her piece here uses audacity, and she describes it wonderfully in her piece. She talks about, was it a trombone she had or something, or was it some kind of wind instrument, but a big one, a trumpet, and she used to bring it on the bus with her, and she'd be afraid of the lads on the bus robbing it, and she was educated here in West Belfast, you know, but she's kind of like holding on to that trumpet is kind of like you know, and she later found out it was a piece of scrap metal anyway, but like she kind of thought it was precious, and she's a wonderful piece where she talks about holding on to that trumpet, you know, insisting on having a place at the table of art, you know, refusing to kind of, you know, be, and that word audacity I think is a wonderful way of describing that. A lot of working class writers have that audacity to see themselves as in environments where they weren't really meant to be. We all know that maybe if you come from a working class background, you know, going to those kind of environments, the first time going to the theatre or going to a poetry reading and feeling like, am I meant to be here? Yeah. Sweaty palm syndrome, you know? Feeling like this is the kind of place that people like me turn up.
Just the term you used of being an amphibian, I think many of us in the room will know how to mutate. Basically, when you're in a certain company or in a certain place, you kind of start to learn how to behave in a certain manner because you've never been in that situation before. You're looking at how other people react and behave, and you're trying to imitate them. And just even thinking about imposter syndrome, there's so many barriers to overcome. And again, when you're just mentioning there about the academic system here and the class system of how some of our children go to grammar school, and it was really whenever I went to grammar school that I first felt that obvious difference of that I was a working class person, that we were poor compared to everybody else because we didn't go on skiing trips, you didn't go, you know, away to France for the summer or the Italian lakes, and your shoes weren't the expensive shoes, so you kind of started to become aware of that. But you also started to think, well, I'm here and I'm going to be able, and that sort of audacity of saying, you're not going to put me down, I'm going to rise no matter what. And there were teachers who actually, I remember just when you were mentioning there about going to Trinity, I remember being nominated as class captain in first year, and the teacher who came in and said, oh, who got nominated, who's the class captain? And it was actually me, and I stood up and said, it's me. And she said, and where do you come from? And I came from a stone throw from the school, which was classed as a ghetto by people who came to gain employment on the road, but looked at everybody from that immediate vicinity like they were dirt on the bottom of their shoe. Not all, but quite a few, you know, in St Dominic's, and you sort of felt that very early on and very young.
And one of the things I love about working class writers is one, they kind of, they're sharing their experiences in regard to that, but another thing they often do is actually the mixture, the way they mix high and low art is actually quite creative and clever in that regard. You think of something like Roddy Doyle's The Commitments, for example, which, you know, manages to produce a kind of very powerful piece of writing, but which is also about soul music and expressivity and people's bodies and being expressive. And I had a little poem, I don't know, we'll see if we have time to play it, but it's a rap viral video poem by Emmett Kieran. I don't know if anyone's seen Emmett Kieran's work, it's great, but he kind of does this thing where he mixes poetry with rap, with activism, with film, and does it in such a wonderful way, and it's very powerful. And again, it's kind of like refusing to say what poetry is this. You know, poetry is wine and cheese at a poetry reading where someone stands stiff and still, you know. He does it in this really expressive way, in this really different way. And I think there's something about working class writers that they do these really interesting things with art and writing. I think, for example, something like Bin Lids, we had 5 stages and you trap the audience in a way for a couple of hours. You've got to stand there, and they don't know where things are going to happen. And it was like trying to make them feel like what it felt like to be in an environment which was mesmerising and scary. To see West Belfast from the inside. And I think that, often they have to find innovative ways of using art and mixing things up.
Yeah.
And I think that's really good as well. So I'll leave it there. If there's time to play that poem by Emma Kieran, we can play it at the end, maybe whatever you think.
There's an awful lot to unpack there. I'm going to pass this over to Kate for a reading just to break us up, and then I'm going to come back to Michael and ask some questions, and then pass some questions to Kate. So Kate, would you like to read from where you are, or help you enough?
Yeah, just
thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, and Michael, that was really interesting. There's a lot of that really resonated with me, particularly even looking back at my parents, and we often talk, my sisters in the audience here, about our mother's secrecy, and it was nearly like a shame of, and yet when our aunt revealed their life, their growing up, she should have been so proud. Do you know what I mean? And it was just incredible. I actually feel very moved, thinking about it, But there's other things like imposter syndrome. Yes, I'm huge. Always have that, and the school. Like when I told my English teacher I was going to do A-level English, she went, "Oh, really?"
That things like that can make or break you as a young child, and
maybe I shouldn't be doing English. You know what I mean? And it sits with you. It really, really does.
But I bet as a teacher, you never made that mistake of making a child feel like that, because you understood and had empathy of maybe not dashing somebody else's dream.
Yeah. So when Eva invited me to finish, she said just write a wee bit about my own writing journey. So this is how I came to write. So I've just written a bit about myself here first of all. So I was born in 1956 and grew up in Anderson's Town, under the shadow of Casement Park. So I was one of 4 girls, and our parents stood without to put us through St Dominic's and St Mary's, in the hope that we would get what Paul McVeigh refers to in the book as a proper job, and not have an easier and a better life than they were having. My father often said people would ask him why he wasn't getting us out to work. 4 girls, get us all out to work as quickly as possible. And we did work. We worked part-time jobs in the city centre, which wasn't easy in the 70s in Belfast. And it meant we couldn't do the Saturday sports, like the hockey and the Saturday things went on at school on Saturdays, But funds were needed and there wasn't any time for socialising. So Sunday night disco in St Gall's, if any of you knew it, at the back of Milltown Cemetery, was the height of it. And I remember in our early days of our childhood, my father would wear his busman's uniform to Mass. Even when he wasn't coming off a shift or going on to a shift, because it was important to them to look respectable, and he had given the only suit he had to his brother, who was going to Manchester to look for a job. So that was his way around it, So, and we didn't think anything different of that. We just in the introduction to the 32, Paul refers to working class writers as coming out of the artistic closet, he called it, later in life. And becoming a writer, he said, is only possible later because financial independence has been achieved elsewhere first. And though I loved it, writing was not an option for me when I left school, because you just couldn't have afforded the luxury of being a writer. And I wouldn't have had the confidence after the A-levels. I wouldn't have had the confidence either, So a few years ago, I was at a writing class where the teacher urged the students, and most of them were younger than me, young ones starting out, to get a job that paid the bills and also gave you time to write. And he was saying ideally part-time work. And I felt like it's so sad that's what they're committed to, and it was a tough call, I thought, for young ones, and more so now in this economic climate at the minute. I mean, how can they do that? So I came late to writing. I was 58 when I came out of that artistic closet. It was 2014 and I was recently widowed, and I had a story to tell. In fact, I didn't realise it then, but I had lots of stories to tell, and I just didn't know how to begin to tell them. And being newly retired and on my own afforded me the opportunity to kind of pursue it, to do something about it. And it was actually my daughter who's here who enrolled me in a class just a few weeks after Paul died. She enrolled me in a class at Queen's, the open learning. They discounted classes for retired people, so she started me off on that. So the story I wanted to write first of all was my husband's story, his birth and adoption, and his 10-year search for his birth family. He had wanted to write it, but he died before he got started. And it's a fascinating story, and it's full of intrigue and cover-ups and a lot of heartbreak, but there's also love and joy there too. And his story reflects the influence of society at the time and the Catholic Church, the big influence of the Catholic Church. And it ran all the way from Belfast to Tipperary and back. And then I felt I was the keeper of the tale and I had to get it written. And I wanted to learn how to write memoirs, and that was where I started then. I also enrolled in Cancer Focus ran, well, they did right up to COVID. I don't know whether they've taken them up again, but they ran free writing classes for anyone who was affected by cancer. And I mean, I think that's most of the population have either lost someone or suffered it or felt it, you know, so I think it's really open to everybody. And this is like interesting what Michael had said there, you know, a friend told me I suffered from imposter syndrome, and I had to Google it, and I saw that she was right. And it's imposter syndrome is something I felt, right, I've had that all my life. And its origins I felt were back when I failed the 11 plus, and being also a part of the seen and not heard generation, you know, of child rearing. But after reading Michael's piece in the 32, I began to see that the origins of it probably were deeper than that. Were probably back in those days of my childhood, you know, growing up, when, you know, we didn't have a lot. We didn't feel deprived, but we realised, you know, there was nothing extra. It was just, you just got on with it, you know. So going back to the stories, I quickly realised that being passionate about telling stories was the first step in learning how to write them. And the second step was meeting established writers who ran the classes and were also passionate about encouraging and supporting their students to write. I have to say I found the writing community in Belfast to be warm and embracing. And Paul referred to this in his bit in the book as well. People did go the extra mile to get people like me started, to get me published and to help me grow in confidence, you know. And with their encouragement, I did begin to get work published, and I learned to give it a go, and I submitted work to journals and competitions. And I also learned not to take it personally when my work was rejected, which it often was.
Yeah.
You know, so because I did take it so personally, you know, I thought, oh God, I'm hopeless. You're back in your box feeling, can't do this, what am I doing, punching above my weight, you know. So I learned to get over that, and just when you let go of a story, let it go, and just embrace what people think.
I think fear is often one of the biggest barriers also, you know, you
ingrained
mentioned a lot of the
in,
barriers people face, and
Yeah.
one of the things that I think is a massive issue for me personally is even submitting work, because
Yeah.
that fear of
Yeah.
rejection can sometimes deject you so much that you
It
don't
does,
want
it
to
does. 'Cause
continue.
you put yourself into your story,
Yeah.
and it's a part of you going out there and people don't like it or don't want it or whatever, but you'd learn to get over that. I mean, the working with other writers helped me with that one, you know. So initially I wrote non-fiction stories about my own life experiences. A piece that I wrote about my husband's treatment as a cancer patient on a clinical trial won second prize in a competition with the Irish Times. And I mean, it was the nurse in the hospital said to me, go and write about Paul and that, but I said, but they're all medics writing this, they're writing about it as, but actually taking it from a human perspective, a person's perspective, obviously resonated with them, and they gave me second prize. And I was
Brilliant.
up there with the medics, you know, and I was like, oh my God, how did that happen, you know? But it did show me that, you know, just write from the heart and put it out there and let it go, you know. The Irish Times also published online a piece that I wrote about the stillbirth of my second son, and they put a call out. I just read one day that they had a call out for child bereavement, you know, and I thought, well, even though it was 30 years ago, I could do this because it's as fresh in my head, and they published it, you know. So that also gave oh right, that's
sort of
right.
moral inside, you're on the right track.
Oh, yes. So I had signed up for, and I would advise anyone to do this, for the Irish Writers Centre in Dublin. They have a free newsletter, and they regularly put out submission opportunities, and bursaries for people. And the call for the 32 was one, and I saw that and I thought, oh gosh, I could write about my parents here in my childhood, and it was accepted too, and that is starting back the old imposter syndrome. I have no business doing it.
But the universe keeps telling you you're on the right path.
And now Geraldine, my sister, and I we're volunteering at the Present Arts Book Festival at the minute, and we're getting into all these events. By volunteering, you can access all of the events. And Sheila, who's been looking after us, was telling us we're actually just asking people now to pay what they can afford. They're not so, and I hadn't realised that, but the classes, a lot of the events, you just go online and you just submit what you can afford to submit, and nobody's going to ask you for more. And I just think it's a brilliant thing that they're doing.
It's removing barriers, especially for people at this time.
Yeah.
People really are feeling the pinch and struggling, and often that can put people off getting involved because it's either the money for the electric or we'll submit the money for a poem.
Absolutely. So we're sitting down there, as much as we can, putting on the t-shirt and helping as much as we can. But we're able to come in the back and see. So I would say to people, look at what's on and look at opportunities. It doesn't have to cost you much to get out there and get doing all this. There's so much going on in Belfast.
Yeah.
There was before COVID, but I think it's really coming back, So back to me, sorry. Gradually I began to expand my writing form, and poetry and stories that I wrote about coping with bereavement and living with grief were published in a journal, and I read from them a few years ago at the Belfast Book Festival. A short story got published in the Honest Ulsterman, and then whenever the 32 accepted my own childhood story, that gave me much needed confidence, and helped me with what Michael referred to as the fish out of water barrier, because just at that time I had accepted an offer of a place at Queen's to do the Masters in creative writing. And I was probably the oldest student in town, and I thought, how can I go into these young ones, and it's been years since I've done anything formal, but then, getting accepted by the 32, it kind of made me feel, okay, well maybe I can write, so it gave me that wee bit of confidence to go in and take that up, So now I'm writing historical fiction. And I never knew I would be doing that, and I did it for my dissertation and absolutely love it. So I thought, well, 8 years ago I would never have believed any of this was possible, So just what I would love to do next is encourage the older population, like me, to discover, as I did, the joy of writing and its healing power. I want to tell them that their stories of value and we need to hear them, because I really believe the older population should be encouraged to record their life experiences, not only of the conflict, but of everyday issues that affect them. And in writing up these events, they'll be capturing history firsthand through the eyes of the participants at the time, demonstrating its impact on real people in real situations. Because I believe there's a wealth of unrecorded stories out there occupying the thoughts of residents in nursing homes, people living alone or people with their family. And I often look at elderly people sitting on their own in benches in the shopping centres or in the park, and I'd just love to go up and say, tell me your story, what's your story, And since I began writing myself, I've met a lot of older people with great life stories, and I find that we have a unique sense of humour and an impassioned honesty and directness. And I just feel we have to find a way to reach out to the older population and enable them to write, or tell their stories and allow them to be recorded. Can't just let the stories die with us. And I think recording them will leave a legacy of genuine insight for the future generation to view their own heritage. But there's another reason why I think this is important, because I think writing memoir is a unique and effective way of processing and dealing with trauma. Because you take the events out of your head where the thinking of them and the replaying of them can consume you and cause depression, you know. On the page you see it and you make sense of it and you order it and you relive the happy memories and you're comforted by them and you breathe life back into those you loved who've gone before you, and then you communicate it and you share it. And I know this is what writing has done for me. There's a book called The 5 People You Meet in Heaven by Mitch Albom, and in it he wrote, lost love is still love. It just takes a different form. You can't see their smile or bring them food or tousle their hair or move them around a dance floor. But when those senses weaken, another heightens, and that's memory. Memory becomes your partner. You nurture it, you hold it, you dance with it. Life has to end, but love doesn't. So I came upon this book by accident in 2009, and I was 54, and my husband Paul was diagnosed out of the blue with stage 4 advanced metastatic bone cancer. And those words started me on my path to writing memoir. And doing that helped me to learn to live with grief. And sharing my story and reading other stories lifted me out of loneliness and despair. And it provided a pathway through the darkest days. And I would love to help other people to find that pathway too, you know. So I hope that my writing journey will encourage others to feel that it's never too late to start writing and it's never too late to get published. I always say to myself, well, David Attenborough and Nancy Pelosi aren't saying to themselves, you're too old, stop it. So I'm not going to tell myself that either, you know. Brilliant. So my piece in the 32 is a tribute to my parents and their struggles and the childhood they provided for us. And it was set at a time when I'd gone with Geraldine to visit our aunt, who we had hardly met because the girls, there'd been 7 of them and they just had to immigrate and disperse. It was working class rural life they came from. So we didn't actually get to meet our aunts until much, much later in life, almost when it was too late, you know. So it was sitting in the garden with her, and this was what inspired me to write the story. So is it okay time? I'll just read a little bit of it then. So my childhood story was one of little surplus, but it was luxury compared to the story of my mother's own life, unfolding now through the voice of her younger sister. The baby of the family, she was born as her mother died in that little farm cottage, no doctor in attendance, the 8th daughter and 9th child of my grandparents. How my grandfather managed being left to bring up all those children and run a farm is unfathomable to me. I suspect, though, that the inner resilience, strength, and survival instinct of a working class family had much to do with it. Certainly, I and my sisters were raised with a cast iron belief that families are always there for each other. It was an impenetrable fact, an intergenerational bond of solid rock. As we sat there together, this is my aunt and I, and Geraldine, each of us immersed in our childhood memories, what came back clearly to me was an enduring sense of my mother's anxiety and my father's quiet strength as the love of 2 devoted parents who struggled to give us everything they never had. I could see my father's shirt wet and pasted to his back with his own sweat after a long evening shift in the bar where he worked extra hours to supplement the family income. I could hear the tapping of my mother's anxious footsteps while she paced the floor, waiting for him to come home as the hours moved on past midnight and his dawn shift on the bus approached. Those were the days before the troubles descended upon us, before his bus would be hijacked, his colleagues killed, and he would endure beatings and threats, working on regardless as the city routinely erupted all around. That afternoon, as the sun sank and I grew colder, I shivered with a sense that perhaps I was an intruder with no business, looking into a past that my mother had kept securely hidden. Her tight-lipped secrets maybe masked a pain that she didn't want revisited. Here was an unfamiliar version of my mother as a young woman who enjoyed a cigarette, who was known by a family nickname I had never heard of, who fabricated her age to make herself older so she could leave the farm early and gain employment. Armed with a letter of introduction from the local priest, she travelled north on her own with only limited education and little knowledge of life beyond the farm. We celebrated that false birthday until her death, when the real date was revealed on an official document. Somehow, around 1939, she got herself digs with a lady on the Cliftonville Road, a job in a city centre cafe, and lived in North Belfast throughout the war years until she married my father in 1948 and moved to Ardoyne. How different her childhood must have been from mine, and how privileged she must have felt we, her children, were. How hard it must have been for her to adapt to city life without the support of her father and her sisters. The glimpse my aunt gave me into this other world showed it to be a harsh one, clothed in hunger and the daily grind of chores, washing clothes in a river, fetching water from a well, bringing cattle to market, smashing stones into gravel for extra income, and walking miles to the chapel or to school along country lanes in the unforgiving Irish winters to be met by authoritarian priests and teachers. Listening to the story of my mother's childhood, I recognised the source of her sheer determination to push us through education, her scepticism of the church, and her fearless challenges to our teachers. And that's it. Beautiful.
One of the things that struck me about your passage, it was very informative. I felt so much of it, like it made a lot of sense to me. It made me understand so much about my own journey. And one of the things you mention is about the history of Ireland and understanding the class system within Ireland and how Irish people in the working class often had a role of labour for either the industrialisation, you talk about immigration, partition and colonisation, not in that order, but I'm trying to just remember off the top of my head. And I guess, do you think that that has impacted on our ability to be further on regarding working class voices being heard compared to Britain whenever you compare common people to the 32? Do you think that that's held us back a lot more than other working class people in other societies?
I think it's the one thing you can't do is graft a simple model of what class is like in British society onto Irish society and then say they're the same. It is different, and even the way people talk about class, some of the people who've done research on this kind of talk about how, you know, they wouldn't use necessarily the term working class in places like Cork. They talk about the grandees or the ordinary people or whatever, you know. In Dublin you might say poshies, etc. I think actually one of the interesting things about the last decade or two is that the term working class and class has become more spoken about down south. Up here I think it's been stronger over a longer period of time. People using terms like working class and talking about class in those terms. But definitely there has been a problem with, I suppose, discussing class in a post-colonial society down south, where you had post-1922 a new dispensation coming in, presenting itself as ridding, Ireland of colonial oppressor, and then wanting to create the idea that it was inheriting and continuing the tradition of cherishing all the children of the nation equally. That was spoken about in the 1916 proclamation, and as we know, not doing so. A society that was increasingly unequal. But one of the things we find down south is people not discussing class for very long periods, certainly in the same way that it was discussed in Britain. And that does have knock-on implications then for people's conscientisation, their awareness of it, their ability to articulate these things, to talk about it. How much is talked about in schools, in political discourse, all of those things. And I think I grew up in a society where class was very little spoken about in the South. I grew up in a Republican socialist family, so I suppose we discussed it, we talked about it, but in general in the society, it wasn't particularly spoken about. And when we look at, let's say, reports from organisations like the OECD, they talk about Ireland in terms of what they term sticky floors and sticky ceilings. You know, people kind of stay on the same level down here, or they stay on the same level up there, not having that kind of social mobility. And Ireland has a particular problem with that down south, and of course there's a particular problem with it up north. One of the big problems is we actually don't have enough statistics on this. So when you look at in Britain, for example, Dave O'Brien, who's written quite a lot about this, is able to find out how many people in publishing come from working class backgrounds. How many people, so you know, that's really important. And that actually does have an impact on us, because Britain, though having 1% of the world population, actually exports more books than any other country in the world, any other state in the world. So the people, Irish people actually look to Britain a lot of time to get published and the likes of that. So it does have a knock-on impact. But we don't have actually a lot of stats on what people are working on academically, in terms of social policy, all that kind of thing. How many people are in the arts, in publishing, enabling other working class people? How many working class people get into those areas down south? We do have a lot of stats from Britain, which are probably very similar to the situation in Ireland as a whole. But often the stats from Britain, even though they produce reports that say they're UK reports, don't include the North. So we don't actually have a lot of information here. What we can say from those reports is that working class people are underrepresented in terms of audiences, engagement with the arts and culture, and then working class people are also underrepresented in terms of producing culture, being involved in making culture and those sorts of things. I think the discussion about this, but this book is really important in terms of beginning and getting people to talk and think about working class voices and writing and how working class people engage in the arts. But it's in its, I wouldn't say infancy, but it certainly isn't as far ahead as it should be.
Yeah.
And even when we look at, let's say, the Arts Council of Ireland down south, they were a long time to come to the idea that art could be for everyone.
Yeah.
Art wasn't just a thing that certain people did. I mean, I even remember in the 90s into the 2000s, we had a culture minister who was really interested in opera, put huge money into that. But there wasn't money being put into really, working class areas in terms of the arts. Up here it was a little bit more advanced, I think, precisely because of the conflict and precisely because of the urgency of being aware of politics. So you do see things like people in West Belfast going around doors, collecting money to have this festival called Féile an Phobal.
Yeah.
Before there was ever a funding regime that might make that actually sustainable, and then they turned it as the funding regimes changed into the 90s in particular, as the say a lot of bad things with the Blair government, but one of the things that New Labour did do is they funneled a lot of money actually into working class areas, which the Tories of course are interested in taking back, but they funneled a lot of money into working class areas and into the arts and working class areas, and that opened up a funding regime where people could actually begin to find ways of getting space for working class voices. So there's a slightly different situation north and south, but what's really galling and glaring is the lack of policy specificity around this, the lack of really good research around this.
Just going to Féile, was it 1987 Féile? 1988? So I remember at that time the external media, the views of outsiders looking into this community. One of the reasons Féile was set up was after the Michael Stone, after the Gibraltar 3 and then the Michael Stone and then the murder of the corporals, and the outside view of this particular area was like we were savages, and these were friends, these were people who you knew, or people's fathers who you knew, that happened to be caught up in that specific day. And we were really, really lucky that there were leaders here in this community who stepped up to the mark to say, no, that is not who we are better than this, and we are going to enable ourselves to be shown on a different stage in a different light. And what it did was it gave people like me, a wee girl from just down in Beachmount, that confidence in ourselves, that spring in our step. And it started with like street parties and disco dancing and getting up and saying a poem or doing wee things like that. But all of a sudden you realised, oh God, we can do this, and then you have people like Tony Devlin, who was a very good friend growing up. Tony's now leading a play every single year at Féile. You've Christine here, one of our stars, and one of the other things that I just want to ask you again, Michael, we've had 12 years of Tory austerity. You mentioned New Labour funding and contributing massively to the area of the arts and to try and give working class disadvantaged children that wee bit of a leg up. During the pandemic, I was very fortunate to be involved in a writing group with Scott and Sel by Leona. We also had Sarah Boyce through PPR, bring a group of us together, and you mentioned about how those voices coming together and using the arts nearly as a movement, because we tackled issues like mental health, poverty. We spoke about things that, you know, you really went deep, you went to places that you didn't really go. And coming back to Kate, we have really the great benefit of being involved with Michael Patrick MacDonald, who focused on the rest of the story and memoir. So how do we get that funding? How do you ring the bell and say, this is working, this is helping people, this is enabling them to heal, it is enabling them to experience cathartic release, and it's enabling them to feel like people, they're more than just the poverty that they're experiencing, they're more than just the depression that they feel. How do we get government to actually look at this and fund it properly?
Well, I think a part of it is building the research case. There's an academic down there, Emma Penny, who's done research, for example, in the 80s in Dublin, and found something similar. There were women in working class areas in North Dublin setting up these writers groups, and actually they kind of came, it's hard to know which was forced to politics or the writers group, because the women were talking about their experiences, poverty, being a woman, the inequality, all those types of things. And then they were turning them into stories, and then they were turning them into poems. And actually, Emma tells us, Emma's research on it, which is groundbreaking in terms of this area, tells a story of how when they set up these groups, then others within the feminist movement got them in, trainers and facilitators, and they were the basis of actually some of the feminist campaigns that came out of that and actually thrived and have been, growing ever since, and have achieved so many things in recent times. But often what happened was actually middle class people were brought in, as professionals to take over as facilitators, and the working class people then in the groups were kind of seen as the participants in the groups, but not as people who could actually take over and get trained and all that kind of stuff. Whereas we saw something quite different happen with Vela here, through a very unusual situation where you actually had a lot of working class people who took over as the directors and the facilitators and the writers and the playwrights and all that kind of thing. Models that allow that to happen are really important, and I think it's just the research, building the research area where we evidence what you're saying, how writing, engagement in the arts changes people's lives. I mean, we've seen recent Tory ministers talk about how 2 weeks, last week was it, they said there was something said about working class kids shouldn't be really encouraged to aim for Oxbridge universities, that's aiming too high. What we want really to encourage is smaller steps of social mobility. Maybe your parents are unemployed, now you have a job, that kind of thing. And really the message that's been put out there, in the last while is that, maybe working class people should stay in their roads, in their stream. You know what I mean? You stay and you go to the technical colleges or whatever, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with doing any type of education. But the idea is kind of, it's very different from what we were hearing from the 90s and 2000s, let's say, policy ideas of social mobility, which was actually creating the idea that we should have more people involved in all aspects of life, that the arts should be open, that working class people should be doing arts degrees, for example. This is one of the recent narratives is, working class kids doing useless degrees, and as if it's a favour to them that the Tories are trying to end that so that they do things that are useful. And the idea is actually to, it's very sinister. The idea is that there shouldn't be as many working class people involved in those areas, learning history, English, drama, all those things, and engaging in the arts. So I think there needs to be a lot of evidencing and a lot of pushback and campaigning.
You nearly feel like, as a medically retired person and as a disabled person, you feel like you're involved and participating in life. And I've actually said this many times to Scott and Sarah about those writing programmes that have enabled us to get through the lockdown, but you really looked forward to that coming together every week. It allowed for you to not feel as isolated or as lonely, But the Zoom revolution in many ways, for people like myself, has enabled you to participate whenever you've been housebound or bedbound for a lot of the time. You can't always make it out to things like that, so it's been amazing in that sense. Coming back to you, Kate, you've answered lots of my questions through your introduction there, and it's just an amazing story that you've tackled grief in that manner, and hopefully that other people, when they hear your story and how you've dealt with it, maybe turning to writing would be therapy for them as well, because I know I certainly feel when I lift the pen, it's like you're finding inner peace, and you find that sort of that centre, that feeling of being home, or being connected to that higher self, or just feeling that you're releasing a lot of that pent up feeling of pain and trauma and grief and everything else that comes along with that. If you could advise anybody, what advice would you give to anybody starting out? What would you say? If you were speaking to somebody here tonight that's never lifted a pen, what would you tell them to begin? How would you tell them to lift the pen and
To
get
go
started?
for it,
Yeah.
absolutely go for it. Just there will be writers' communities out there. I mean, this is what I find. That there were people. Well, once I went to one class and sitting talking to other people, and then we exchanged contact, and then we started meeting up and writing, and then entering competitions, and sharing our own kind of issues. I suppose it became like a therapy class, So it's just definitely to get out there and go for it, to believe in yourself, kind of. I think because I kind of tiptoed into the first classes, going, so what am I actually doing here, But then you start meeting people, and there's a great sense in Belfast. I find people want to help you.
Yeah.
There's that kind of sense of community really, really very, very quickly kicked in, and it's just making that first step and getting out there, and putting your work out there, and not being not taking it personally, that I had to learn that one.
Yeah.
That they didn't like that, or no.
That's one of the big issues, I think, that
huge inferiority comes
yeah.
out very quickly. Oh, I can't write,
Yeah.
this means I can't write, and then you get over it,
One of the things I found critical in the writing groups that we've participated in between PPR, the one with Gloria Mona and the one with Damien Gorman, that peer support and peer evaluation is so important, because like Scott would allow us to critique each other's work, but not in a way where you were insulting, but we're all very honest with each other. If something didn't seem great, or you can improve it this way or another, and I think that's really, really important to hear what other people have to say, because that fear of rejection, that you're maybe going to submit something, if you've had a conversation with somebody beforehand, it might just give you that little bit of an edge to say, I can maybe make it better, I can improve it this way or another.
Yeah.
And nobody was offended by, any of the sort of evaluations that we gave to each other during that period, Scott. And I have to say, we were so very, very lucky to have Scott facilitating it. And Scott's also a working class voice who's now down at Trinity doing great things. But Michael, when you then transferred from Trinity to Queen's, had you lost that inferiority complex, or that sort of that feeling of, you've went to one of the best universities in Ireland, you've achieved great things, you're now in Queen's University. Have you lost that skin of shame that Paul speaks about? The more you wear that cloak of shame, it becomes faded. Are you over that now? Would you be more forceful and?
I feel like I'm being psychoanalyzed. There is a sense. Someone Kate was saying as well there, but rejection and stuff, like childhood experiences stay with you, and they're deep inside you somewhere. And actually, what you realise as you get a bit older is that a lot of what your instinctual, your knee-jerk reactions to things are actually somewhere deep inside, cumulatively, the effect of a kind of, or over-determined by these experiences you've had over the periods of a whole lifetime. It's like Paul and me going back to that moment in 1963, and we don't even remember half the things that have shaped our feelings, our reactions to things. I remember seeing an article about turning 40, and it said, one of the things, it's just a listed thing, one of those, general articles about how your life changes. And one of the things was, you realize, you begin to realize everyone's winging it, And I think that is so true. As maybe as you do get a bit older, you stop being as much as easily cowed by that sense of imposter syndrome, and you begin to check yourself more and say, no, I'm not going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one of the things I read in that book that Ona Burnell's book now is about working class academics. One of the things that was right across all those chapters is how profoundly people are shaped by their childhoods and by the poverty of their childhoods, and how it's shaped their characters and how much of it is still there in them somewhere. So I don't know if these things ever quite leave you, but I think we get better at coping with them as we go on, hopefully.
I'm going to open it up to the audience. Would anybody like to ask a question or
Comment?
Mickey, how did you feel about being...
Oh.
We've got another American star.
Great chapter in the book as well.
Mickey Nolan actually is one of the contributors of the book, and great things are on their way for Mickey. He's about to, his book next year, is going to be launched. But Mickey actually came along and read for us last week as part of a celebration of our rest of the story, and it was just such a healing day. Everybody felt great. We had Louise Kennedy there as well, and it was just phenomenal. So Mickey, did this help you find that inner warrior?
It was interesting actually what you were saying, because I went to university and did all that shit, and felt that kind of displacement and these kind of weird pressures to assimilate and to sort of fit in, and that's what university is. It reproduces class inequalities in all sorts of ways, But what you were saying there, and I think it's interesting that when you actually, one of the big pressures of going to university these days, I think, for young people, is to get a good job. You go to get qualifications that allow you to enter the world of work and make a living, and there's pressure on people to do that. And it falls into what you're saying about sort of the arts and humanities and how there's all these barriers, of course, even within them, in terms of the vast majority of people that do them are from middle class backgrounds, because there's a degree of economic stability and financial stability, and there's all these kind of safety nets around them. Whereas when you come from where we come from, I guess, those safety nets don't exist the same way. Compound that with the pressure to kind of, get a good job, go and start business, or fucking, go to do accountancy. Who wants to do that? But the amount of people who I know who went on to university from middle class backgrounds, that's been where their parents have kind of pushed them. Really smart and really creative people. A friend of mine actually always wanted to work in fashion, and she always sticks in my head, because I remember because she did accountancy and did brilliant, and really successful, but hated the job, and she's sort of stuck in it, and she can't get out. Mm-hmm. And it's and her parents are they push her in that direction, but it's obviously not their fault, because they want what's best for their children in all sorts of ways, But that was another thing that I was thinking about whenever you were talking about, and of course the New Labour thing of pumping a lot of money into sort of social mobility sort of things. Mm-hmm. They also introduced tuition fees, which changed everything. Tuition fees, that's a big. I mean, now they're paying $9,500 to go to university for a year, across the water anyway, and it's only a matter of time, I think, before it comes here. But these kind of barriers are set, and I think that's one of the things that I think about a lot is. It's really hard to write well, I guess, and so much a part of the reason I did it is that my mother was sort of supportive in how I went about doing it, and I was lucky in that way. But if it's so hard for working class people to get to university on at a ground level, and even when they get there, there's these barriers that they're confronted with, compounded by the tuition fees. and the pressure to get a professional job or make money and accommodations another thing. It gets really, really hard to be a writer through them circumstances, because you need to be to learn the trade. You know, it's like your time at university is almost like the apprenticeship, because that's when you're reading, that's when you're thinking, and that's when you're critically engaging in ways. You know, so there's so few working class writers that come through that.
Yeah.
You know, and it's narrowing all the time, always narrowing, in all sorts of ways. Like, you know.
Yeah, if you're a single mother, you may as well just forget it.
You may as well throw your hands up, you know, and it's part of the reason why so many people come to it later in life, which is amazing, you know, and I know loads of, particularly older women, who were sort of, you know, like, things got in the way, whether it be children or trying to provide for whoever it is, care as well. I mean, like, it's always women
something.
who have to care for the elderly parents and all this kind of thing. And these kind of barriers just affect them in all sorts of ways. But there's been incredible, like Louise Kennedy, for instance, you know, he was a chef for 30 years, and now he's like...
Yeah, we were just talking about Louise earlier. It's a phenomenal story.
She started writing like 6 years ago and has written a genuine masterpiece, like, you know, an absolute stomper of a book, like, and she's kind of just like...
She's so modest,
she's like, I don't know how I did this, you know, and like, I was watching her being interviewed last night, and they were sort of asking her, you know, and she was like, I don't fucking know, you know, but she just fell into it, and one of the things the interviewer was trying to get to was like, was there something in you? You know, it was almost like this, was there something innate in you?
One of the things with Michael Patrick, I think the activism, there's talk of activism and how that can shape people, and I would say his activism actually enabled him to finally get his voice out there and put, you know, pen to paper and get his story out there. And I think in many ways it's kind of nearly by accident that with Sarah, we've all became activists as a result of being involved in one writing group. And what you said about you become, it's like like-minded people start to sort of come into your life, and you're thinking, I'm definitely on the right path here, this is definitely where I'm meant to be. And you're in company with people who were in all different aspects or all different walks of life. Like Adele, your background is law, and you know, you've Christine there with the amateur dramatics, and but your journey has been fascinating, and you've been all over the world with your drama. So it's like, we can do it, and you just need to rise up. We're the many, not the few. You know, let's get off our feet and just get the pen on the paper and keep pushing on, because you know, our stories need to be told. Is there anything else anybody would like to add?
I would just like to, this fascinating, thanks a million, it's brilliant. But I was really struck when you were talking about the single mothers and the women and caring those, and the women in the tenements, you know, and it's like the invisibility of that vital voice still persists to the day of the older people, and the need and the yearning within us all to tell. It's such a very human thing to share. This happened to me, and to have it received and have it mirrored back actually is, and that in itself is that's the thing. It's not necessarily, you know, but there's another thing that was just, you know, there's a wee bit of touch on education there. In terms of going forward, like phrase, but I've recently been supporting some of the kids that are doing exams around poetry, and if ever you wanted to suck the life and kill any interest in anything to do with creativity and writing English, it is brutal. It is like, I can't describe how just flat, and it was flat on the page. It wasn't even, it was like, I still remember reading a couple of poems when I was really young, and they were seminal in terms of my interest. Now you kind of go, I talk to wee kids and they're like, you know, but they're like owl boys from like 1,000 years ago. Right, okay, this is what that's showing me a YouTube video, and going, that's what it's about there, you know, and then you kind of break it down into like you know, 3 sentences. That's what that poem's about. You know,
That's the answer.
That's it.
And you need brave
And you need to
teachers
have
who
an answer.
educate
You know,
them.
it's like brutal. You have to have an answer. You have to be able to explain this and use words rather than let it open you up.
Yeah.
You know?
The stagnation of that curriculum of what is, you know, being forced upon children often switches them off, and your influences have actually shaped you and your research and how you've pushed that within your life. Do you think that that's something needs looked at drastically? There needs to be more working class voices on the curriculum. So like when Paul says about, I can't remember if it was Paul or yourself, if you can see it, you can be it. If they're not seeing voices that represent them and they're not being taught them voices on the curriculum, it's very hard to see them as writers when they grow up, you know.
I think, like, you know, people like Roddy Dog were included on the leaving cert down south. There's been moves towards all those sorts of things, but yeah, there definitely needs to be more, without a doubt, and things where, you know, powerful art where young people can see themselves and find, you know, find a voice that resonates with their own experiences. And it's interesting what you said there about that. Siobhan, that interaction between activism and art. You know, when people find a voice, actually, it's a route to actually doing things and changing the world, as Paulo Freire kind of said. You know, and you do see that with things like, for example, Fela. You know, Chrissy Vikshekas or Chrissy Keenan would say that when she started off, they started off with these street parties. You know, around and people were doing art things in little bits, but most of those groups turned into residential groups.
Yeah.
So they started saying, hang on a minute, what else can we do? You know, it's very interesting when people what art can do in terms of transforming people. Once they find a voice, expressivity, begin sharing things, it can be a medium, actually, a touchstone for something else.
Yeah, even like I'm just thinking there when you're mentioning Fela again, there was a girl who knocked about with us, Brona McCann, and Brona was the best dancer you've ever seen. And I can remember going over to the Beachmount houses, which was the old white houses before they were knocked down. It was actually called New Beachmount, but it was treated like you were filth. You were like the end of the world. You were the Dublin tenements if you lived there. People looked at you. You were the dirt in the bottom of people's shoes. And Brona McCann was this amazing dancer, and Fela had a competition, so we all went over to watch Brona dancing. Brona ended up becoming a dance teacher and has then, you know, brought so many children from this working class area to different parts of the world and to be part of dance competitions that I firmly believe that Fela enabled her to see herself as this amazing dance teacher because she was able to live that experience. Likewise, Tony Devlin, you know, Tony's plays are all over the world at times, and it's just amazing to see that journey, and hopefully that empowerment will come with more, you know, with more Felas. If Fela's now branching out to Lisburn and we're seeing Fela grow in different areas, you know, people are replicating what's happened here. And I know you mentioned about Derry as well, and again that sort of working class community in Derry would be very similar to what the people here, or, you know, Ballymurphy had experienced. You know, you have a lot of the conflict related trauma that people are able to express themselves through the medium of writing, and just get that out there. I've been currently working with the Ballymurphy families and different people from Relatives for Justice, and they've never written poetry before, and we came here on a trip one day and every single one of them have written a poem, every single one of them, and it's just phenomenal to see people who have never lifted a pen. And I think it's just creating that space, creating that time. And again, it's so important that it's mentioned in the book. Paul McVeigh talks about leaving that breadcrumb of the trail of breadcrumbs for people behind you. You know, pull people up with you. Don't get to the sticky top of the ceiling and leave the rest at the bottom. I think that's really, really important, and I think that's something that Fela has created an ethos here. So thank you very much. If anybody else would like to say anything else, sorry.
So say thank you very much. The book, the bits I've read of it are brilliant. I wanted to touch on what had been said at the start about kind of class structure and perception of how it manifests itself in the university, in the south, in the north, and in England. I come from a sort of a middle class Protestant background. Newton Ards, went to school in East Belfast, posh school. We couldn't go compete in sports cross border because our sports were things like shooting.
Yeah.
And so Campbell College wouldn't be going to shoot against Clongowes or Blackrock. The rugby team would have played each other. But I went to England, and actually my experience coming from a sort of a Protestant middle class background is that Northern Ireland is very different to the south and very different to England. And in England, I mixed with upper class English people, the landlord class, those who own properties and aren't trapped in middle class mortgages, loans, for education loans for cars and all those things, and I mixed with a lot of working class people who got into the same university as me. The working class ones wouldn't go and do the rowing or wouldn't do the army service in the officer training corps, but they'd be much more fun on the social events.
Best crack.
The best crack, and the upper class people wouldn't say anything derogatory. It was the middle class social climbers, and especially on the Protestant side in Northern Ireland, people putting on fancier accents, excuse my accent. I've been out in Northern Ireland for 25 years, but I thought what you were saying about class and how it manifests itself, the North and the South, and in England, in universities. Literature is a great thing, but I think there are other artistic and creative things that are more maybe accessible to people who don't want to write poetry or write stories. And I love reading, but I worked for many years in Madagascar, and we worked with using participatory video as a tool to try and completely empower peasant farmers. Peasant not in a derogatory sense, but peasant as in people who subsist on their farms, and training them how to make their own videos about whatever they want to make it about. And they make it about their cattle, or they make it about the mining company that they absolutely hate who's kicked them off their land, or they make it about whatever the day-to-day problems are. They don't have any public services, no water, no health, no education, and they need help in those things. So literature in the world is a brilliant tool, especially for empowering working class people and getting that message out there. But there are other creative things that are super important as well. Thank you very much, it's a brilliant event. And
Thank you for coming, and I hope you feel very welcome. It's always great to have people from outside the Falls Road coming to RSC Connula. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you so much for